Welcome to GTM Confessions, where we share what it takes to be a go-to-market professional today, because it is freaking hard and it's far from the glamorous picture that social media often paints. Consider the show your weekly go-to-market therapy session. I'm your host, Stephanie Cox. I have more than 20 years of experience and I've done almost everything go-to-market related in my career. In this episode, I chat with Rachel Elsts Downey about the purpose of podcasting, how to know if a podcast makes sense for your business or personal brand, how to get started and measure effectiveness, and so much more. Welcome to the show, Rachel.
Stephanie, great to see you. Thanks for having me.
Excited to talk to you about podcasting because you are the reason I got into podcasting in 2018. So
Wild.
It's wild. It feels like full circle now. And I think you and I both believe that podcasting is a huge advantage for both companies and for personal brands. So what if you kind of level set for us and tell us, how do you best describe the purpose of podcasting?
Yeah, I love that question because most people don't even think to ask it. But I think the best way to think about podcasting and sort of the purpose behind it, the brand needs to define it for themselves in terms of like the outcome they're looking to attach to it. But I really think podcasting is the most human way to scale your brand because it's coming from a place of authenticity because it's inherently human first content. It's conversation based typically. You're capturing video, you're capturing audio, you're capturing people in life. And so to me, it's the most authentic way. So the way that I think about that even more like concretely is like it allows you to speak directly to your audience. It is long form content that can be repurposed. And so it's not just like one channel either, but it is also other content that you can leverage across your other channels that you are building or maintaining.
So I feel like we've seen this big influx, or at least it seems that way, of companies moving towards creating podcasts. Because when I started, there wasn't a lot of people doing it. And now it feels like, at least in SaaS, everyone has one. And then you've seen a lot of celebrities start podcasts. But if we think about it from like a business aspect, how do you know if you should create a podcast or if you shouldn't?
Well, I think there's a couple ways to think about it. One, I love that you clarified and said it feels like everyone is launching a podcast, like specifically in SaaS, because the reality is it's still pretty blue ocean, which is crazy to think about. And I also come from originally, I've been in content marketing for over a decade now. And it's like, I always think about the wave of content marketing and sort of like everyone had a blog and all of a sudden it felt like everyone has a blog. Should I have a blog? And the answer is yes. Like actually, yes, you should have a blog. You should have a podcast. How you leverage your podcast, what it's for, all those details can change. What your expectations are of a podcast also needs to probably change or be adapted, or at least understand like how you think about it. But I totally went off a tangent. What was your actual question?
My actual question was, how do you know if you should create a podcast as a company? Because to your point, right? Like there are a lot, at least the noise seems like there's a ton of podcasts, but you and I both know that's not true. And so I think a lot of companies are kind of wrestling with the idea of like, should I create one? Should I not create one? And there's a ton of misconceptions out there about that, which I know we'll get to. But if you were advising someone, this is what I would say you need to think about if you're going to create a podcast. What would you say?
If you value human first content, you should create a podcast. That's the simplest way I think about it. And really too, like if your business values or is putting resources around thought leadership, if your business values and recognizes that they might have complex stories that they need to tell, they should have a podcast. If they're looking to deepen relationships within a niche audience, they should have a podcast. I think the CEO of Spotify said this a couple years ago, and it resonates to be true today, which is podcasts are a sea of niches. That's what makes it so beautiful. And so if you're in B2B or B2C or whatever, if you have a niche audience, you should have a podcast is the way that I think about it. But it has to be tied to a business outcome because otherwise it'll pod fade or it'll fall flat or you won't get the maximum impact that you can get out of it.
So when you say business outcome, what typically does that look like for most companies?
Yeah, so I've kind of distilled it into one of three, but technically there's one of four. So there's typically four reasons that you should attach your podcast effort to. One is the most obvious, which is build brand. Like, I want to use this as an opportunity to generate brand awareness. It could be a top of funnel opportunity. Just be consistent in the marketplace with one key message, one like specific point of view. I think about your podcast as your kind of always on content. And so that's how I think about that as like outcome. Typically one is build brand. The other two, and then there is another, is drive demand. Like, I need to use this as an opportunity to actually drive demand. But again, all great marketers know that brand drives demand. And so if you're doing it well, it should be also doing that. But your priorities and how you think about your guest strategy, where you invest your dollars, that's where the outcomes sort of pull the different levers that you need. The third and fourth are grow an audience. Now, you're going to challenge me on this because I know you launched a personal podcast that is popping off. But I typically say that if you're in B2B and you're saying, I want to launch a podcast to grow an audience, I would first ask you, do you already have an audience? Because a podcast is not actually the best channel to grow a net new audience, but it is a good channel to engage your audience and then grow it further from there. And then the fourth one that doesn't really get a lot of media is using your podcast for part of your recruiting and retention. Like, give a snapshot into your culture and the employees and the people that you serve and the unique company stories that maybe you don't get an opportunity to tell. So your show could also be an avenue for that outcome as well.
I love that, especially the last one, because I think it's so underutilized. Because one of the things that I like to do when I talk to other leaders or before I meet them, I go and see if they've been on other podcasts and try and listen to them to get a sense of like their personality. I do the same thing before I talk to any guest on this show. I want to understand more of who you are and how you might respond to questions, what you feel comfortable with. And it gives you a lot of insight into their personality that is very different than what someone might write on like a LinkedIn or on X or etc. Because that is tends to be a lot more polished versus their kind of live reactions as they're speaking.
Which is why I say, like, if you believe in creating human first content, you should have a podcast because it gets you into who I am, not who I think I need to be pretty quickly. Now, it might take some warming up and all that kind of stuff, but you get the vibe much more readily. And to that end too, like you said, from a guest outreach perspective, connecting with leaders, et cetera. But like, think about that from a sales perspective. We use that a lot to be like, let's go figure out who these people are and what they actually care about. And like, do that by listening to the podcast that they've been on. Imagine the outreach of personalization that you get from just understanding who they are and what they're talking about in the wild. And that comes off way more authentically than, I think you have this problem when you have no idea. You know what I mean?
Yeah, the standard like spray and pray emails that we all get, they're like, you probably have this problem. I saw that you worked at this. You live in Indiana. You must love the Colts.
Yes. Like, what? Like, I get emails all the time for cleaning services. I'm like, what are you talking about? I don't need my office cleaned. Like, what? Anyways, so.
Whereas they could just listen to you on a variety of podcasts and have a good understanding about who you are, what your problems are, how you think about things, how receptive you might be to different things. I always find that funny because I've talked, especially years ago, about how I'm a big believer. This is like when video was still new and sending personalized videos to people. And I probably talked about that on like 24 podcasts. Like, that is to me, like the creme de la creme way to reach out. And I would get like maybe 2 videos a year from people reaching out to me.
You're like, I told you this is how it works for me. I gave you the answer.
Yes. Multiple times. Like, if you Googled my name and outreach, it probably came up multiple times that you should do this.
It's wild. Well, and honestly, it just shows the intention. And I think that's part of this whole idea around everybody has a podcast. And it's like, yeah, sure, everybody might seem like they do, or should they? Sure. But really, it comes down to intent. And like, what is the intention behind this? And what are you going to put into it to make it have the success that you want it to have?
Let's flip it a little bit and talk about personal brand, because I think that's the other thing we've started to see, especially in the last like couple years. It seems that there are a lot of individuals creating their own shows, not tied to a company. Why would someone do that?
As opposed to doing it for their B2B brand or whatever?
Yeah. Or just in general, like as an individual person, why would you think it's a good idea to create a podcast talking about whatever it is you're passionate about?
Well, I think the other thing that kind of floats around in our shared worlds in the B2B space is like this idea of like trust and how do you build trust and all those kinds of things. And the reality is you build trust by showing up consistently over time, and speaking about the things that you know, that you want to know, that you care about. And so the other kind of like thing with podcasting that I think is really unique to the medium is that you can actually build trust at scale by leveraging the podcast channel. And so if you're a person that wants to be known for something, you have to show up for something consistently over time. And so that's kind of the answer of like, should I build a podcast because I want to build a personal brand? Then the answer is probably yes. And it's the same reasons as why a B2B brand or B2C brand would want to do it, or B2D2C, or whatever those acronyms are. It's all the same reason. It just comes back to like, what's your motivation and what's your why, and how are you ultimately going to measure success for this thing? And so the other piece around personal brand that's always interesting to me is like, at the end of the day, and you know this to be true too, it's like, we only buy from people. Like the brands behind you may change, the logos behind you may change, but wherever Stephanie goes, I'm probably going to engage with her in some capacity because I bought into Stephanie a long, long time ago. And so it's the same thing for people too. So it's like, if you want to have like a career with longevity and you want people to come to you for a specific, again, a level of expertise, it's like they need to know who you are, what you care about, and that you are consistent in consistent in that, what's the word I'm looking for? In that pursuit. And so that's my answer. And then the same thing on that too is like, again, going back to like the power of podcasting, it's both a channel and content. And so in all the other channels that you're looking to grow and be present, you're going to want to pull content that is authentic, that is you, and put that into those other channels as well.
Yeah, the other thing I'd add to it that I've found is I don't think people understand, especially when they help launch a show at a company and they're the host, and it might be really their personal brand that's driving a lot of the show. They don't own that show. And
Right.
so if they leave, they don't get to take it with them. And I think that's a misconception that a lot of people have, even if it's kind of is their baby. And that's another thing I would just say, like to your point, if you're trying to build your personal brand, there's a lot of value to doing that as an individual versus tying it to wherever you are at that time. It's very different if you're the CEO and founder of the company, obviously.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and to that end too, like, there's things that you can negotiate too. Like you can actually negotiate with your companies of like, hey, let's build this show together. I'd love to be the host. But like you could actually negotiate sort of owning it if you were to leave, or as part of like a severance, taking it with you, because a lot of companies don't know, either they don't have the time to figure it out, or they don't like, want to think about it. But we've had several clients where they take the show with them as part of their like severance, and then they take it to their new company, or they get a brand sponsor to come in and keep it going. And it's one of the reasons that we launched, I'll do like a 10-second plug on this just because I think it's relevant. We launched like this cohort model that we have for more personal brand motions, so that people can create with the guidance and like help without having to have it bankrolled by the company behind them.
No, I love that. So when people create a podcast, there is, and I've heard this, and you and I've talked about this, there are lots of these misconceptions. My favorite one is it's really hard, it's going to take a long time. But what are the other misconceptions that you've heard that prevent people or companies from starting a podcast, and how do we combat them?
So this is a misconception. I'm curious if you agree. But for me, one of the biggest misconceptions of that is that you can start talking and figure it out later. Yeah.
I have a visceral reaction to that. That's like the worst. I've seen people do that. I've listened to shows that are like that, and I'm like, please don't.
Like stop. Because like we don't actually need more content, but your audience might need your content. And so I think it's like that's kind of that balance of like the misconception of like, I can just start talking, people are going to pay attention and it's going to go off. It's like, no. And also like, you might not need it to go off. So like the thing I always say is like, really focus on strategy, focus on the content, making it intentional, making sure you're designing it for somebody specifically in mind, make sure you understand and think about how you're going to distribute it. Like those like details, even if it evolves over time, evolution is completely different than just starting without a plan. And so it's like, start with a theory of victory, execute against that theory, and then evolve it over time is the way that I think about it. I think the other misconception is because it's easy to start, it's easy to maintain. Like those are also two different things that people don't always like recognize until they're into it and go, wow, there's a lot of moving parts here, or there's so much more I could be doing here. yes, 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 yes. So just like thinking about those things preemptively. And then the other misconception is what you and I talked about at the very beginning of this is like everybody has a podcast. No, they don't. They really don't. And it is still blue ocean. And so if you have some intentionality, if you have some distribution plans in mind, like you can actually stand out still today, even if it feels crowded.
Well, I think part of it's like it feels crowded sometimes because of like the circle that you're in.
Yes.
I talk to people about this all the time. You know, in B2B, especially in B2B SaaS, it feels like everyone is talking about AI and AI is the hottest thing. You talk to anyone else in any other industry, they're like, we're not talking
What?
about AI. Like, what are you
Yes.
doing? And I'm just like, you got to take a step back. And it's the same thing with podcasting. Sometimes you see, based on algorithms, right? People who post the most, have the most content, have the most followers, they get the most reactions and engagements. So then they populate your feed. And so then you think everyone's doing something. And the reality is, no, it's just like the same 20 or 30 people that you see all the time.
Exactly. Which is why it's like go back to who your audience is and like that niche and like make like because they might need your show. It doesn't matter if John Doe has a show too. That John Doe is not in your space. You just follow him because you like what he's saying. It's that's so true. And I think that's the thing that is helpful in general is like anchoring back on like truth and reality. And I think the AI thing is so point on. I follow Chelsea Castle, and she just posted something on LinkedIn today that was like only like 10% of the US are actually using AI in their day to day. And I guarantee if you and I pulled up our LinkedIn feed, everyone's talking about their use case of AI this week. And it's like not everyone's playing at that level, and that's completely fine. So it's like find your lane and own that lane, and this is the space to do it.
Agreed. So if you were to recommend, and you're kind of like the expert, I learned everything I know about podcasting from you. So if
That's
you were to
scary, but okay.
no, it's fantastic. It's worked really well over 7 years. I've launched multiple
Amazing.
shows and made mistakes just like everyone else has. But what is your recommended approach for starting a podcast? Like, how do you think about going from idea to kind of launch?
Yeah. So to not give out my entire blueprint, but I don't actually care. The number one thing is what everyone says that like this is not like this isn't novel, but it's like start with why. Like what is the actual business outcome that you need the show to attach to? From there, it's like understanding who your audience is specifically, where they currently hang out. Because one of the misconceptions, again, is that if I launch a podcast, they will come. It's like, that's not true. You're going to launch a podcast, and it's probably going to be no one comes for at least 6 months because they have to know that you even have this thing. And so making sure that you're clear on like who your audience is and where they currently are. And then the other thing that I really encourage people to really think about is like, what's going to be different for your audience as a result of your show existing? So like, what's going to change for them? And that answering that question is an important exercise because it makes sure that you're not launching into a sea of sameness, and you're launching into a sea of like adding value to their life so that you can actually get the sort of idea of building trust at scale. And then again, like the other thing I like to think about is making sure you're treating your podcast as both, like I said it before, so I apologize if I'm becoming redundant, but it's the truth. Treating your podcast as both a channel and content, because they are two different things, so that you're maximizing the juice that can come out of the squeeze, if you will.
I love that you said about kind of like, why does your show exist? What's the business impact tied to it? Because I feel like that's what so many people forget is like, what is the, like, why are you doing this? Like, what is the purpose? And then also, I know with every show that I've launched, I've done like a ton of research and listened to an obscene amount of other shows to figure out where the gaps are.
Yes.
Like, what would make us different? What would make my point of view different? Because you can just launch into a sea of sameness and you're not going to, it's not going to be super helpful unless you can bring something extremely unique that no one else is doing. But I feel like that's what people miss is they're like, I'm going to launch this type of show and it's going to be like this. And I'm like, well, there are 25 other shows out there like that. Why would I listen to yours? I need a
Yeah.
little bit something different.
Well, and I think like to your point too, like the other thing I think a lot of people forget to do in terms of the steps of the process, and this is more tactical, but developing a show flow is something that a lot of people don't do. Like we have a lot of people who migrate to us and I'm like, well, do you have a show flow? Can we see it? And they don't have one. And I think people forget the point of why that matters. And so a show flow for us is essentially it's your episode roadmap of like how each episode is consistently produced. And again, these things can evolve, they can change, etc. But then you're supposed to take what we advise is that you then take that show flow and you leverage that into an episode level framework. And so your kind of like your beats of your show don't change, but the details change based on your guest or your topic. And because people don't do that, their show lacks intentionality and it lacks depth. And it starts to feel like a transaction and not a conversation, and no stories are actually told. And so I think that those are the things where it's like, it feels annoying to do when you look at the world and say, everyone has a podcast and it's so easy to start. And it's like, yes, yes, yes. But if you just slowed down and actually thought through a few of these things and then took it to life and practiced against those things, you would have a much better product that represents your brand, is more fun to create, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the things that like very specifically I would point out that people tend to not do and they definitely should do.
I can tell when a show doesn't have a show flow when
I
I
love
listen
that.
to it.
I love
And
that.
it gives me the hives because
Yes,
I'm just like, I
you're
don't,
annoyed.
I'm annoyed. And I think what's frustrating is even if you watch, I think this is why TV shows and movies are so great. There is, if you watch Grey's Anatomy, right, there are 21 seasons, there is a flow to every episode. You know what to expect. You know we're going to get some big drama at the mid-series finale. You know that there's going to be some sort of cliffhanger that's going to make us come back the next week. And podcasting should be the same thing because I want to know what to expect when I watch your show. I
Every
don't want to
single
be
time.
I don't want to be surprised every single time.
Yes. And you also start to, if you think about this from a brand experience perspective, again, going back to this idea of like podcasting can help create trust at scale, like that, like part of that brand experience begins with paying attention to the experience you're creating for your audience. And so it's like taking the time to think it through. It doesn't have to be like super in depth or heady, but it has to be like, you have to at least thought about it. You know what I mean? And I think that like that's a representation of your brand. So if you just get on the mic and ramble and have no flow for where you're taking people, both your guest or your audience, you're actually giving them a bad brand experience. And so it's like taking the time to do this is so worthwhile on so many layers.
No, completely agree. So, how if I want to start a podcast and I come to you and I'm like, I'm going to start a podcast, what is the typical time frame from idea to like show launch that you see?
Yeah. So what we see is if you're moving quickly, honestly, you can launch a show in 30 to 60 days, I would say. Like that's pretty fair and decent and you're going to have good quality. It depends on things like internal approvals and how ready you are with messaging and how quickly you can gather the assets and blah, 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 blah. But I think that that's fair. I like to say, give yourself 90 days. And the reason I say 90 days is because you give more room for like practicing. And so like I also say this too, like your production schedule doesn't have to be the same as your release schedule, and your release schedule doesn't have to be the same as your promotion schedule. And so I think that's another thing that people don't fully understand. Like they think it's like apples to apples or black and white, and it's not. Because the interview that I have with Stephanie, if that's my first interview, might not be my best episode to launch with. Matter of fact, I might never air that and say, hey, Stephanie, I'm going to talk to you in 6 months when I get better. And I think giving yourself the grace for that is super important, especially if you're going back to why you're doing this. So if you're like, this is a brand effort, this is a brand awareness thing, I'm not probably going to launch my first episode unless my host is just phenomenal. You know, like there's so many elements to that, but I just think giving yourself the space to actually create is something I would challenge and encourage people to do.
So there's a lot of tools that you can and resources that you can use for starting a podcast. And it feels like if you just Google on the internet, you need a lot of things. And there are pros and cons to every single one of them. And it's almost because I went through this recently with starting this show. I was like, okay, it's been a couple years since I've launched something. I want to kind of just research and see what I should be doing differently. And it was overwhelming.
Yeah. And you also look at everything and you're like, it can do that. It can do that. That's amazing. I want that. And you're like, maybe I don't even need it though. You know what I mean?
Exactly. So what would you say is kind of like in an ideal world, what you recommend in terms of tools and resources every single podcast should have if they want to create high quality, engaging content?
Yeah. So I love the tool we're on right now, which is Riverside. So I would highly recommend Riverside for a virtual remote setup. And even if you have an in-person studio, where your guests are in person, I still recommend everybody has a Riverside account because it just allows you to like create content, even like micro content, in a studio type environment. So we use Riverside, and then we use Descript to collaborate with our clients. We have some like, what would you call it? Experts in using Descript for all its bells and whistles. So you can get a really, really great product using those two tools. The other tool that we use for clients that have more, like, I would say elevated or in-depth production would be Adobe. Like those are kind of like our little editing toolbox. We have a whole bunch of other tools on top of that I don't even know anymore just because we've grown. But those are like the things that you can definitely do. And then you need a hosting platform for distribution. I honestly don't recommend Spotify for podcasters. I know it's free, but I don't recommend it because Spotify's in it for Spotify. Let's be real. Your hosting platforms are in it for you to host and have great access to the things. So like I would definitely look into the tools. We're using Transistor for the majority of our clients. We have like our clients basically pay us the lightest version, but they get the biggest version with us kind of vibe so they can get more analytics and things like that. If you're a B2B brand and you want to understand like who is listening to your show, which is something that a lot of people want, we use co-host for our clients to help do that. And then we also use Audience Plus. So that's kind of like some higher tech stacky things that we tack on top of it. But that's kind of like the minimum that you can do, if that's helpful.
It is. I would also say, obviously, you need a good mic. Please,
Oh yeah,
if you're
the
gonna
hardware.
if you're gonna host, please God, do not use your AirPods.
No, don't use your AirPods. No.
Like, if you want to use them to listen, like I am, that's
Yeah.
great. But like, please don't use them for the audio or your MacBook speaker. Other
No.
thing I don't love.
No. And honestly, even like if you don't want to spend the $300 to get a good mic, a wired headset is better than the Bluetooth. So go old school with the $14.99, wired headset would be better.
Agreed.
Yeah. I do a little Logitech webcam just for a
Same.
little bit better view. But it's like you can get a nice little setup for under $1,000, like easy. And again, it all ties back to what's the brand experience that you're looking to create. And I think a mic goes a long way with just showing that you care about the quality.
Completely agree. And the other thing I would add too is hire a designer
Yes.
to, like, for your graphics.
Yes.
That to me is a big thing. Even if you are going to take that in-house or do it yourself, like have them set up templates for you that look highly designed, because there's nothing worse than listening to really great content but seeing all of the promotion of it not feel as high quality.
That and the other thing I would say with that is like when we're thinking about distribution of your show across the other channels that you can leverage it from, like you want some nice looking thumbnails for YouTube. You know what I mean? Like you want some branded elements that just reinforce what this is and who you are. So like taking again the time to just think through that is really nice. Now, if you just want to launch a show because you're just like, I'm trying to have conversations with people I want to learn from, that's fine. But you are potentially creating again that negative brand experience that doesn't enforce what you're actually trying to do. And then the last thing I would say is like, this is not tech, but it is like person. So it's like you do want somebody, I call it a strategic lead in our world. You do want someone thinking about the content holistically and sort of like how it's getting integrated into the larger marketing ecosystem. So if you have somebody on your team who can do that, amazing. And if they, you know what I mean? There's like the podcast domain expertise as well, but you definitely want somebody on your team who's helping do that. Otherwise, this becomes something that just like dies on the vine.
Very much so. And I think the other misconception I'd add to that is like, I think people think when they start, oh, it'll be really easy if this is the content I'll create. Yes. And then as you get into it, it is going to change so
Yes.
much and how you want to promote the show, what resonates. And it's almost like the first, at least for me, like 60 to 90 days after the show launches is constant iteration of changing how I talk about it, how I promote it, what works, what doesn't work, that I think people misunderstand.
Totally. And I think there's also like, again, we're in a playbook culture where everyone's just like, this is the best practice and rip this playbook and use this chat GPT input. It's going to work. Okay, it's a good starting point, but like you have to have somebody who is looking at the data in a meaningful way so that you know what levers to pull and why. The other thing I think that's really important is like organic growth is critical to help you understand if your messages is resonating. But if you need audience, you're going to have to pay for it because people don't know about your show. Like you just don't. And so those are the other things that I think people just need to be aware of. But again, you anchor back on the outcome and you can make decisions from a place of I don't care or I do care based on the outcome you're looking to achieve.
So that kind of is a great segue into common challenges after podcast launch, because at least from my perspective, having done this a couple times, the one you just mentioned is like the biggest one, which is people just assume I put it in the ethos, everyone comes and listens, I get hundreds of thousands of downloads immediately, and that is not what happens, people.
No, and it's not going to again like anchoring back on truth where it's like how big is your audience today? And how are they consuming content today? Are you introducing a brand new thing into their world? It's going to be a slower adoption. You know what I mean? So it's just like keeping those things in mind. But I think like to keep it more like general, I would say some of the common challenges are keeping it consistent. Like more different priorities pop up and all of a sudden this is not the priority when you had all the energy for it 6 months ago. Again, going back to measuring success, like alignment on what success looks like between everyone in your organization. And then getting buy-in across teams. So the other thing that I think is really important is your show really shouldn't be a siloed effort, especially if this is a brand play to, again, kind of build trust at scale and get your humans out there. And so making sure that your team understands how they can be using it across CX or sales or product or marketing, just like taking the time to educate the team and listening on like what would be valuable to them. And then I would say to your point too, of just like that idea of evolution, like every time that we're launching a show with our client, like we're like, this is a creative endeavor. So it is going to naturally be iterative. And you're going to evolve. You're going to learn different things about yourself. And so just giving yourself the grace to even like play in that space too, I think is really important. Yeah.
I like to tell people I think about podcasting like a website,
Yeah.
because you would never create a website without having a sitemap, a content outline, goals. You would never just create it and leave it and never touch it again. It's going to be constantly analyzed, optimized, tweaked, changed, refreshed. And I feel like people don't think about podcasting that way, and it gets really
Why?
stale. I
Yeah.
don't I don't know either.
Like,
I really don't.
yeah, it's kind of like, and I mean, even taking that analogy into every facet of your business, your product doesn't remain stale. You know what I mean? Even your leadership doesn't remain stale. Like anything that you're putting energy into requires continued energy. And so I think that's the biggest thing that, even going back to the top of our conversation of like, should you start a podcast? Yes, I think you should, but only if you're going to put in the effort it takes to make it great. That doesn't mean you have to have $100,000 budget for your podcast. Doesn't mean you know what I mean? It doesn't mean that. It's literally around the intention and like what you're willing to do and when.
Yeah, when anyone asks me my personal opinion on should they start a podcast,
Yeah.
and the question I ask them back is, are you willing to commit to this for a year?
Yes, I should start doing that. I need to add that to my sales conversations every single time.
And they're like, what do you mean? I was like, because you're going to need a year
Yes.
before you really start to see the success that you're going to think is going to come in 60 and 90 days.
Well, the success, but even like enough data to know whether or not it's moving the needle forward for you in some meaningful way. Um, so it's so true. Because again, going back to the timeline question of like, yeah, you can launch a show in 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. Okay, well, right then and there, that's about 3 months of just the pre-production planning, the getting the production rhythm under your belt, building out the workflow that works for you and your organization, and literally, if you're the host, how that's going to work with their schedule. Like all of those little micro decisions that have to be made along the way creates impact to that long-term success.
It really does. So I might scare some people away when I ask that question, but I feel like if I don't be honest with them and say, you need to commit to this for a year or you shouldn't do it,
Yeah. Or
they're
just
just
wait
going to
until
create
you
crappy
can.
content. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. Totally. And it's also a good question to ask when you think about who your host should be. It's like who can show up consistently in this way, or who, like, give me a name. Several people can be part of the show, but it's like, again, making those decisions along the way.
Exactly. So one of the things I love about podcasting, and I know you do too as a content marketer, is there's so much great content to be reused. And I think people don't do that well enough. So how do you think about the best ways to reuse podcast content effectively for a brand or for a personal brand?
Well, I think you know what I'm going to say, but I'm going to say start with a plan. And when I say start with a plan, I mean make sure you know what channels you're looking to optimize your content for. But then also in the pre-production piece of this, most people don't do this, which is go into it with a theory of victory around the content. And you can actually then mine for that content on the calls. And this isn't like a Rachel thing. This is an NPR thing. Like, this is how you create like great content from a podcast experience. It's not just like show up and throw up. It's like, hey, I want content for my brand about this thing. This guest can talk about it. I'm going to get that on that in that conversation. So again, going in there with that plan so that you're maximizing it purposefully. But then like the general ways that you can leverage it that can be strategic for your company is obviously you're going to get a transcription and you can leverage that transcription into written content. You're obviously going to be able to get video clips and shorts and things like that for putting on LinkedIn, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, all of those beautiful places that we want to be found. The reason I didn't lead with that is because I said, is because you need to mine for those clips on purpose. So we call it, I don't know if we call it that or whatever, but there's the underlord of AI, right? Where you put that transcription in and it'll tell you the clips that are most compelling. That's a false god. Like you need to know what clips you're looking for before the underlord tells you what good was. So I just like to call that out because we are relying on things that we haven't fully curated. So I like to just say that. But then of course you can turn those transcriptions and those episodes into newsletters, into blogs, into long form content. You can use quotes, honestly, and clips in your sales outreach. Like one of my favorite use cases is maximizing your microphone time. So when you're on the mic with somebody, you can actually get those testimonials. You can get those like little clips that maybe don't make the cut of the episode because that doesn't serve the purpose of that channel, but it serves your content that you need over here. So it's like maximizing that mic time. So it's not necessarily reusing podcast content, but you are reusing your mic time. And really it's just like the best content in my mind is sort of like reused and leveraged and repurposed. We've had several clients in the past who have leveraged their show into like coffee table books. And like even like posters that they send out to the guests of like, hey, you said this really amazing quote. We put it into a poster for you. Like you can get so creative by just using the genius that is the people that come on your show. But hopefully that's helpful in terms of ideas because there's plenty out there.
There are, and I think one thing I see people do is they assume they only promote that show and episode for like the week or 2 weeks that it's out. And it's funny because I remember the first show we launched together, which I still like personally pay to have hosted.
Yeah.
People listen to episodes that are 7 years old.
They do.
And I don't think people realize that like there are still people actively listening to content that is way older. It's not being promoted right now, but they're finding it from a variety of different places. So that's one thing I always feel like is important is don't think it's going to just be the 1 or 2 week promotion depending on the frequency of your show. Like you should reuse that content over a long period of time until it's no longer maybe accurate or because sometimes content can get outdated. But otherwise, if it's kind of evergreen, why wouldn't you continue to promote it for all of eternity?
Well, and I think it's an interesting note there too, because, when we think about the success of a show, we've had clients who have said to us, I don't care about the downloads of the podcast. I love the engagement I'm seeing on the short form. And so it's like literally a lot of the mistakes I also see people do is that they think of the content from the podcast as just to promote the podcast. And actually it's like, no, let's just leverage this content as native social content for LinkedIn. Let's leverage this as native social content for YouTube. Like there's all different ways to like package and leverage it that has nothing to do with actually growing your podcast audience. So again, it all comes back down to why are we doing this and how can we maximize it for real business impact?
So we've talked about it and skirted the topic a little bit. Yeah. Podcast effectiveness.
Yeah.
How do you even think about measuring it? Because I think we, like as a marketer, grew up in the world where like you have to measure everything. There has to be a clear ROI, and podcast to me is brand, and brand is squishy.
Very squishy. Yeah.
Very
So
squishy.
I think about it really in two buckets. There's show level and there's business level. And as a partner, I can give you all the show level, and then I can ask you questions to understand the business level, essentially. But we've sort of come up with this idea of like success versus performance metrics. And so success metrics are defined by the brand. Why are you doing this, and what metrics help you feel like this is moving in the right direction? And some of those metrics, to your point, are squishy. They're more anecdotal. But some of them are maybe like web traffic, demo requests, newsletter signups, direct feedback, that kind of thing. Like, did they mention that they found us on our form because of the podcast? Those kinds of things. Did a conversation turn into a relationship that led to an engagement? Like those are the stories that we can help our clients tell by asking really good questions. But on the show level thing, the way that we measure success for our clients is by helping them answer 3 questions consistently. Those questions are we growing? So when I look at your dashboard, do I see the downloads going up and to the right? And if not, why? My second question I'm going to ask is, how is the content performing? And the way that we understand there's 2 tails that come off that question. One is like consumption, like how much of an episode is actually being consumed to help us know editorially that we're creating good content. And then the second question within that is what topics are popping off? What guests are performing really well? Just to help us understand like if there's patterns of content we should be leaning into, or is this an opportunity for us to leverage this show's content into other forms of media because your audience obviously is resonating with it. And then the last question we ask is our audience taking the intended action? So what are we actually asking our guests or audience to do after listening to the episode? If it's a follow, if it's a subscribe, which is kind of the inherent answer, is that going up and to the right? Or is it a newsletter sign up? Is this feeding into something else, and are people doing it? So we're going to ask those questions every single time to help us understand the performance metrics of this channel alongside our client, to help them evaluate kind of the return of investment, if you will.
And I always am surprised by it, at least with every show, because sometimes the guests that you think will be the biggest draw aren't. And then guests that you didn't expect to drive the most traffic in terms of like engagement, downloads, views of video clips do. And then the other piece that I think is really important that a lot of people don't think about is, because you can reuse this content on TikTok, YouTube Shorts, etc. There are times where like I've seen, like just from the shows that I run, podcasts like 5,000 views on YouTube Shorts of a video that didn't equate to 5,000 downloads, but there was a ton of views and engagement. And then you start to see, right, other people subscribing to your channel, like other things happening that are the impact that you're having overall. But those people may not be into podcasts, listening to podcasts.
Right. Yes.
Or it's on their list, because unless you're doing a show that is timely and related to like what's happening in the world today, which most shows are not that way, they're not going to likely listen to it immediately after it comes out, unless you're a huge celebrity who has another huge celebrity on it, right? You're not, unless you're Call Her Daddy, right? Or like the Kelsey brothers or Kylie Kelsey or someone where there's like a ton of traction that first week or two after an episode drops. You're going to see like this long tail of people listening to it over time.
Which goes back to your point earlier of like, are you willing to commit to this for a year? And it's also why our tagline is, it's never just a podcast. Because for a brand, for a personal brand, for a brand, period. Like, you are using this as a vehicle to do something else. You are typically not launching a show to become Alex Cooper. You know what I mean? Like, or whatever. Like, you are, if that happens, blessings. You know what I mean? That's awesome. But there's a lot of elements to that. I think that people just kind of have like this false narrative around it. And part of it is because they're scared or they're lazy, honestly. And it's like, you just got to decide why you're doing it and anchor back on the truth of what you're trying to do.
So let's talk AI, because we've
Yay.
mentioned it a couple of times. Right now, if you look at least on LinkedIn, AI can do everything. It can write content for you. It can write emails for you. It can basically become you. What impact do you think AI will have on podcasting?
I think we're seeing it already. Still a ton of misconceptions around it. In my experience, AI still can't replace a great editor. AI still can't replace like a great producer, which is somebody who's curating your content. The danger of AI when it comes to content creation, in my experience, is that it makes things up completely. Like it'll say something like the episode could be all around blue skies and it'll generate takeaways and things like that. And it's talking about red seas. And you're like, bro, this is not what it had anything to do with. So to me, AI is helping us sort of do creativity at scale. It's letting us like create cooler effects faster. It's reducing some of our workflow time. So your time to produce should be going down. That's the experience that I'm seeing. It is helping us get to 70% faster. But to me, AI has to have the human sandwich. And I don't see that going away at all. Because the heart of any great content, any great brand is still the human voice. It's still the human stories, the conversation. And AI can't replace that. And if we let AI replace that, then shame on us.
So last question. What is your biggest go-to-market confession?
This one I'm so torn on. Because I'm like, what do I mean by confession? Like, is this something I'm like ashamed of, or is this just something that's true? I don't
Either
know.
or both.
Okay. Yeah, I think my biggest go-to-market like confession or thought really is that the best go-to-market moves ultimately still come down to conversations. And so it's like talking to your audience, talking to your customers, talking to your team, talking to your advisors. Like that's always going to give you the better insight than anything else out there. And that puts you in a spot of being vulnerable. And that's the piece that people don't want to do. But that's the best way, in my experience, to know how to go to market and what to do when you get there.
You've been listening to GTM Confessions. If you love what you've heard, make sure to subscribe, rate, and review our podcast. And don't forget to tell a friend.